Caroline Leavitt mocked Jasmine Crockett's education on live TV, thinking she'd fluster her. What happened next turned the entire room on its head and left the internet stunned. It's cute how some folks think being loud equals being smart. Caroline Leavitt didn't even blink when she said it. Her tone was smooth, practiced, and sharp enough to draw blood, but it was the smirk that followed that hit harder than the words themselves. The kind of smirk that wasn't meant just for the person sitting across from her, but for the cameras, the audience, the clips that would surely flood social media within they were live on national television. A Friday night special broadcast from a studio in Des Moines, Iowa. The topic was education, race, and politics. Three words that never mixed quietly. Five panelists, one moderator, and two women who represented polar opposites of America's current divide. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. The air in the studio was already tense, but that moment that dig shifted something. It didn't matter if you were sitting in the room or watching from home. You felt it like someone had just dared the wrong person at the wrong time. Jasmine leaned back slightly in her chair. She didn't reach for her mic, didn't clench her jaw. She simply looked at Caroline, her eyes steady, and let the silence do some of the heavy lifting. The moderator, clearly sensing things about to escalate, adjusted in his seat and tried to move on. But Jasmine wasn't done. You see moments like that don't come out of nowhere. They come from history. Tension whispers behind closed doors. They're born from people smiling in your face while trying to cut you down in coded language. And tonight, that language was on full display for millions to see. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't have to. They did something worse. They laughed. Not all of them, but enough. It was the kind of laugh that isn't loud. It's nervous, scattered sharp around the edges, and Caroline heard it. She sat up straighter. She liked the sound of it, but Jasmine, she stayed still. She had heard that laugh her whole life. Now rewind a few minutes. Let's backtrack before the clapback that would send headlines spinning. Because it wasn't always this quiet, this tense. Just 30 minutes earlier, the stage was being lit. Microphones checked, producers hustling around with last-minute instructions. Jasmine had arrived calm and collected, dressed in an emerald blazer with minimal jewelry, simple direct. She was ready to speak on what she knew best across the room. Caroline adjusted her curls and whispered something to the makeup artist. Barely glancing Jasmine's way, she didn't need to. Her body language already said it all. I'm here to dominate, not to dialogue. It wasn't Jasmine's first time on live television, but something about this night felt different. Maybe it was the energy in the building. Maybe it was the way the producers had framed the segment. Two women, one table, different Americas. She had rolled her eyes at that tagline, but she came anyway because she always comes when it matters. That's what her father used to tell her. Show up even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. And now here she was showing up again and being mocked for it. For her education, for her intelligence, for her right to sit in that chair. Caroline's jab wasn't just personal, it was strategic. It was meant to reduce to refrain. Jasmine, not as a lawmaker, not as an attorney, but as someone who didn't belong in that room. Not really, but something was about to happen that no one in that studio, not Caroline, not the moderator, not even Jasmine herself, could have fully predicted. Because when you've spent your whole life preparing for a moment you didn't know was coming, it doesn't catch you off guard, it reveals who you are. The green room was too cold. Jasmine Crockett wrapped her hands around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee and glanced at the monitor on the wall. It showed a live feed from the studio still empty, just rows of clean chairs under soft lights. The crew buzzed around adjusting cable testing audio level. She took a breath steady and quiet. She'd done this before debates panels, interviews, but this one felt different, not because of the stakes, but because of the opponent. Caroline Leavitt had built her brand on two things: precision and provocation. She knew how to needle and she knew how to smile while doing it. Jasmine had studied her tactics not out of fear but out of respect for the game. You don't walk into a storm pretending it's sunshine. Jasmine was dressed with intention, dark green blazer, white blouse, sleek gold earring. Not flashy. Not loud, just enough to say, I didn't come here to argue, I came here to be heard. She ran a finger across her notes one last time. Case law, education, statistics, examples of systemic bias in policy. She wouldn't need most of it. What mattered tonight wasn't what she said, but how she carried what she said across the room. One of the producers handed Caroline a mic pack. Caroline didn't glance over, but her voice traveled. "I just hope we don't turn this into a therapy session about feelings," she said with a little chuckle. Loud enough for the room to hear, Jasmine didn't respond. Not because she missed it, but because she'd already categorized the comment. Low-furred instead, she took a seat near the mirror, pulled out her phone, and opened a text thread with her older brother Miles. "Miles, you got this. Be precise and breathe." She smiled. He always knew when she was overthinking. Jasmine, always a knock on the door, pulled her back into the room. The stage manager stepped in, headset in place. 5 minutes, y'all." Caroline stood immediately, adjusting her jacket like she was stepping onto a runway. Jasmine stood slower, taking one last look at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were focused but tired in a way that only people who've had to prove themselves twice as hard recognize. She walked past Caroline without a word. No smile, no nod. Just forward, the hallway to the stage was narrow. You could hear the murmur of the audience as they filed in. Mostly local folks, college students, political junkies, a few reporters. They were told to stay neutral, but audiences always picked a side long before the show began. As they reached the edge of the stage, Caroline leaned in, voice low. "Don't take it personal tonight," she said. "It's just politics." Jasmine turned to her. "You don't have to tell me how the game works," she replied. "I just play it differently." The moderator was already seated, papers in hand, eyes darting between his notes and the countdown clock. Jasmine took her place. She sat tall still, like the only tree in a field that had learned not to bend every time the wind showed up. The lights dim theme. Music played a red tally. Light blinked on the camera. They were live. The moderator welcomed the audience, introduced the panel, and ran through the topic: the intersection of public education and political bias. Caroline smiled like it was a photo op. Jasmine adjusted her mic and waited. She didn't need the spotlight, she just needed the floor. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who talks first, it's the one who waits until the silence becomes impossible to ignore. The studio lights were brighter than expected, but Jasmine didn't squint. She kept her eyes locked forward, letting the shine bounce off her blazer-like armor. Caroline sat diagonally across from her legs, smiling like she knew something the rest of them didn't. The moderator cleared his throat. "Let's begin with a simple question. Is the public school system doing enough to prepare students for real-world success?" Regardless of background, Caroline jumped in first almost too quickly. "Well, I think it's clear to anyone who's paying attention that public schools, especially in urban areas, are failing students. We spend billions, but students can't read at grade level. And rather than address accountability, we keep blaming the system. It's about personal responsibility, not excuses." Her voice was crisp, her tone polished. A few audience members nodded, but Jasmine could already feel it, the setup. It wasn't just about schools. It was about positioning the idea that failure only looks like certain zip codes, certain faces. Jasmine waited a beat, then she leaned toward her mic, toward her. "You know, it's interesting how quickly we label something as failure. When we don't understand the obstacles, most of the students I've worked with didn't lack intelligence. They lacked opportunity. And when systems are built without them in mind, the problem isn't effort, it's design." The tension clicked up a notch. Not enough to spark, but enough to tingle. Caroline smiled again, sharper this time. "Sure, but you're a lawyer, right? You made it out, so why can't others do the same?" Jasmine tilted her head. "I didn't make it out, I made it through." And that's a very different thing. There was a shift then, small but real. A few people in the crowd sat up straighter. The moderator leaned in slightly, sensing the heat beginning to rise. He moved to another panelist, a former principal from Arizona, but Caroline wasn't done. Her hand went up halfway. "If I can jump in real quick, because I think we're dancing around something. Let's be honest, some degrees just don't carry the same weight. And if you're going to sit at the table making decisions, people want to know. You didn't just slide in because of a quota there, it was clean sharp and dressed up in the language of merit." The moderator didn't interrupt. Maybe he didn't know how, or maybe he wanted to see where it would go. Jasmine took a slow breath. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She let the words sit in the air like the smoke they were. The crowd shifted. Some were clearly uncomfortable. A young woman in the second row looked down at her lap. A man near the back whispered something to the person next to him, but Jasmine didn't speak yet. One of the other panelists tried to pivot the conversation. Well, if we're talking about credentials, it might help to remember that public trust isn't built just on paper. It's built on performance, too. Jasmine looked at him briefly, then turned her attention back to Karoline. Still no reply. Not yet. Karoline looked satisfied, like she just sealed a point. She crossed her arms loosely, eyes flicking toward the audience. The posture of someone used to being congratulated for crossing lines with a smile. The moderator shuffled his paper. Representative Crockett. Do you have a response before we move on? Jasmine nodded once slowly. She leaned into the mic. Her voice was calm even, but she wasn't about to let it slide, because some moments ask you to be polite. Others demand that you remind people exactly who they're dealing with. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't smile, and she didn't rush. Instead, she adjusted her mic gently as if preparing to give a measured response to a weather report. Not a personal attack, you know. Karoline, she began, voice steady. There's a difference between confidence and condescension. One invites conversation, the other hides behind it. The studio went quiet. I graduated magna cum laude from Prairie View and M. She continued, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. Earned my law degree from the University of Houston. Passed the bar on my first try. I worked public defense cases in some of the most under-resourced courtrooms in Texas. I wasn't given anything. I fought for it. Every room I've entered, I earned my way into it. She paused just long enough and let me be clear. She added, if you think the name of a school defines the quality of someone's mind, you're not questioning education, you're questioning exposure. There was a beat of silence. Pure, loaded silence. Karoline's smile faltered just for a second. Her mouth opened, then shut again. She hadn't expected Jasmine to take it there. Not with that kind of clarity. Not without raising her voice. Not without dragging her through the mud. Jasmine never broke eye contact. It's funny, she said, leaning back ever so slightly. How folks underestimate you when they're afraid you might outwork them. And that was it. The line cut through the studio like a quiet thunderclap. A ripple of audible gas rolled through the audience. No yelling, no theatrics. Just that single sentence sitting in the air like a weight. One of the college students in the audience started clapping. It was hesitant at first, then it spread. A few people stood up. A few just watched, processing. The moderator flustered, tried to regain control. Okay, let's keep this civil. Everyone, but there was nothing univocal about what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't insulted anyone. She'd answered a challenge with truth, and she'd done it in a way that wasn't meant to sting. It was meant to reveal. Karoline reached for her water bottle. Her hand moved too quickly, almost like she was trying to create a distraction from her expression. She still hadn't responded. Another panelist, a quiet economist from St. Louis, cleared his throat. That I say was, well said, Representative. Really well said. Jasmine turned her head slightly toward him and gave a small nod. Not of thanks, but acknowledgement. She didn't need affirmation. She knew what she had said and why. Karoline finally spoke again, but her voice had lost some of its rhythm. Well, I think credentials are one thing, but results are what matter. Agreed. Jasmine replied, not missing a beat. And the result tonight is that the audience just learned exactly who earned her seat at this table. That brought another reaction from the crowd, louder. This time the moderator raised a hand. Okay, we're going to move to our next topic, but thank you both for, your passion. Jasmine sat back in her chair. She didn't look at Karoline again. She didn't need to. The damage wasn't in what she said. It was in how clear it made everything that had just happened. Because when someone tries to shrink you down and you stand firm without needing to attack, that's not just strength. That's control. But the night wasn't over yet, and the room, still buzzing from what had just happened, wasn't quite done with her either. Even as the moderator tried to steer the conversation toward federal funding, gaps in teacher shortages, the energy in the room lingered around Jasmine. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't pointed fingers, but somehow she'd said more in those 30 seconds than some people say. In an entire career, the moderator cleared his throat again. Let's shift gears slightly. Representative Crockett, how do you believe state governments can play a more active role in improving public education outcomes? Jasmine didn't jump in immediately. She glanced around the table briefly at the moderator, then at the other panelists, and last at Karoline, who was suddenly very interested in her notes. When we talk about outcomes, Jasmine said, her tone returning to that measured ease, we can't keep pretending the finish line is the same for everybody. You can't compare a student who walked 3 miles to a school with no heat to one who got SAT prep built into their curriculum. A few people in the audience nodded. One woman mouthed, thank you. And it's not about pity. It's not about handouts. It's about acknowledgement. That's the baseline. You can't fix what you're too proud to admit is broken. She turned slightly toward the moderator. The role of the state should be to level the field, not tip it further, but too often the decisions are made by people who've never had to walk the road they're designing. That's why representation matters not just in race, but in lived experience. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't throw buzzwords around, she just told the truth clearly and plainly. The moderator turned to Karoline. Would you like to respond? Karoline adjusted her mic. I just think it's dangerous to constantly frame America as divided between the privileged and the oppressed. It creates resentment. People should focus on what unites us. Right, Jasmine replied, but unity without honesty is just a cover-up. There was a murmur from the audience again. Low but audible, Karoline looked visibly irritated now. Well, I didn't come here to be lectured on struggle, and I didn't come here to be reduced to mine, Jasmine replied calmly. The moderator leaned forward again, clearly trying to tamp things down. Let's bring this back to policy, but the conversation had already moved beyond policy. This was personal, not just between Jasmine and Karoline, but for everyone watching, for every viewer who'd been overlooked or talked over or sized up based on assumptions before they even spoke a word. One of the panelists, a professor from Oregon, finally spoke up. It's easy to talk about meritocracy when the ladder you climbed was already leaning against the right wall. What I appreciate about Representative Crockett's points is that they aren't emotional. They're grounded in experience that should matter. Jasmine looked at him. No nod, no smile. Just acknowledgement. Karoline leaned back, arms folded. So we're just going to pretend that credentials from lesser-known schools are equal to Ivy League degrees. Jasmine leaned forward. We're going to stop pretending that brand names are a substitute for character. That's what we're going to stop doing. A pause, then she added, because I'd rather be taught by someone who understands the value of effort than someone who assumes they're superior because of a crest on their diploma. This time the applause came quicker, sharper. A few people clapped, then a few more. The moderator didn't even try to stop it this time. He let it ride. Karoline stayed quiet because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like retreat or resentment. But while Jasmine had won that round, she knew how this worked. Winning the moment doesn't always mean winning the narrative, and what happened after the cameras cut could matter just as much. When the segment wrapped, the studio lights dimmed slightly, and the broadcast rolled into a pre-taped commercial about school funding reform in Oklahoma. The tension didn't lift it, just changed shape. Karoline rose first, tossing a quick thanks to the moderator before stepping off the platform. She didn't look at Jasmine, not even once, not during the polite post-show shuffle, not while shaking hands with the producer, not even when someone asked for a group photo near the side curtain. Jasmine didn't move immediately. She stayed seated for a second longer than necessary, scanning the room, not looking for applause but for calm. She reached for her water, took a sip, and then stood quietly. A young production assistant walked over to unsip her mic. You smoke that? He whispered with a smile, trying not to be heard, like, wow. Jasmine gave a quiet thank you and didn't linger. She knew what just happened wasn't a performance. It was something heavier, a pressure release for people watching who needed someone to say it right for once. As she made her way off stage, a small crowd began to form. Not the loud kind, not fanfare. More like people pulling her aside with hushed voices and loaded glances. One woman in her late 20s wearing a dusty pink coat and holding a press pass stepped toward her. I just want to say thank you, she said. My mom's a teacher. She's dealt with the exact kind of thing you were talking about. You said it better than I've ever heard anyone say it. Jasmine placed a hand lightly on the woman's shoulder. Tell your mom she's not alone nearby. A tall man in a navy suit tried to play it cool as he waited his turn. I work for a state senator in Minnesota. He said, "You should know we'll be quoting you tomorrow." Jasmine smiled faintly but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Someone else leaned in. This time a college student, maybe 20, maybe younger. His voice cracked slightly. "I'm in pre-law. Everyone keeps telling me I need to go to Yale or it doesn't count." I was starting to believe them. "You just changed something for me." That one hit her differently. Not because it surprised her, but because it didn't. She looked him in the eyes. "It counts when you show up and prove why you belong. A school name can't do that, only you can." He nodded hard. His hands were shaking a little. Karoline, meanwhile, was on the far side of the room, surrounded by two aides and one older man who looked like a donor. They were deep in quiet conversation, avoiding eye contact with anyone not on their side of the circle. It wasn't hostility, it was discomfort. The kind that shows up when someone who wasn't supposed to win the moment walks away with it anyway. The panelists were eventually ushered to a private lounge to debrief. Jasmine sat on a couch alone for a minute. The professor from Morgan walked over and sat beside her. Not too close. "Not too far, I just wanted to tell you you're poised tonight." That wasn't just impressive, it was rare. She looked at him, not with pride, but clarity. "I've had to practice it more than you know." He nodded across the room. The moderator walked in, flipping through his phone. "We're already trending," he said. "Your line's being quoted all over Twitter. Representative, the one about being underestimated." Jasmine shrugged. "That's not new." He chuckled awkwardly, unsure if she was joking. "One of the producers came over with her coat cars ready when you were." Jasmine stood up slowly, gathered her notes, and nodded at the few remaining people in the room. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't floating on attention. She was tired, but not in a defeated way, in the way a person feels after carrying the weight of being composed, while being challenged again and coming out the other side still intact. But there was still the ride back to the hotel, the solitude and the thoughts she'd have to sit with once the applause was gone. The ride back to the hotel was quiet. Jasmine sat in the back of a black SUV, her blazer folded neatly on her lap. The driver didn't make small talk, just soft jazz on the radio, the kind that plays in the background, and never asked for attention. She stared out the window at the grid of Des Moines streets. Neon signs from closed restaurants reflected off the glass. A group of teenagers walked past a corner gas station, laughing jackets pulled up against the cold. Jasmine wasn't replaying her performance. She was thinking about her mother. Years ago, her mom had come home late from a night shift at the hospital, still wearing her scrubs, and found Jasmine asleep at the kitchen table, face buried in a history textbook pen, still in hand instead of waking her. She'd sat beside her and rested a hand on her daughter's back that night. Jasmine didn't hear her mother say it, but she would later. She works harder than anyone sees. That's what tonight felt like. A quiet echo of all the moments that built her. All the time she'd walked into rooms where her presence raised eyebrows before she even spoke. All the little digs disguised as jokes. All the lowered expectations dressed up as concern. She hadn't planned to deliver a speech tonight. She hadn't planned to take a shot. She had planned to tell the truth, and when Karoline gave her that opening, she did. She glanced at her phone. Dozens of missed texts, her team, her brothers, even old classmates. Most were screenshots, links, clips. One message stood out miles. "They tried it, you handled it. Proud of you." She smiled when the car pulled up in front of the hotel. The valet came around to open the door. Jasmine stepped out slowly, stretching her legs. Her heels clicked against the concrete as she crossed into the lobby. A few people turned to look at her. One man at the bar nodded politely, clearly recognizing her from the show. She went straight to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited just as the doors began to close. A soft voice called out, "Hold it!" Jasmine stuck out her hand. A woman slid in just in time, mid-50s, warm brown eyes, and a long scarf wrapped twice around her neck. "I saw you on TV just now," the woman said. "You were, woo, that was something." Jasmine smiled, modest. "Appreciate it." "No, really," the woman said, her tone softening. "My daughter's in law school. She watches these things trying to figure out who she can model herself after she called me after your panel crying. She said, "Mama, I needed that. I needed to see that. So, thank you." Jasmine didn't know what to say. There were words for policy, for press, for interviews. But this moment wasn't that. "You tell her to keep going," Jasmine said finally. Even when people try to make her feel small, especially then, the elevator dinged. Jasmine stepped off on her floor hard, a little fuller than when she left the studio inside her room. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't scroll. She sat at the edge of the bed, pulled off her shoes, and just sat in silence. Not the heavy kind, the earned kind. There was no dramatic music, no sudden moment of triumph, just a quiet truth she had spoken from where it mattered, and people heard her. But what lingered most wasn't the applause, it was the look on that young woman's face. The student in the crowd, the mother in the elevator. They were the reason Jasmine showed up in the first place. 2 days later, Jasmine sat in her kitchen back in Dallas barefoot hair, tied up a warm mug of tea resting between her palms. The headlines had started to fade. New clips had taken over the internet, but her inbox was still full. Dozens of emails from teachers, law students, parents, strangers. Some shared their own stories of being dismissed. Others just wrote 2 words, "Thank you." She didn't respond to every message she couldn't, but she read them, all of them. She hadn't meant to become a moment, she just spoken the truth. But the truth, when said plainly and confidently, can stop the noise around it. That's what had happened on that stage. It was less about the insult Karoline threw, and more about how many people had been silently waiting for someone like Jasmine to respond. Because it's not always the insult itself that leaves a mark. It's the way the room reacts, the way some people laugh too quickly, the way others look down the way. Silence wraps around the moment like plastic. You feel it more than you hear it. And if you're the one being underestimated, you don't just remember it, you carry it. But what Jasmine did on that stage wasn't just a comeback. It was a correction, and more importantly, it was a mirror. She held up her own story, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. You don't have to come from where they expect to matter. You don't have to speak like they do to be heard. You don't have to wear their credentials to be respected, but the world won't always give you that respect. Sometimes you have to stand in the middle of the room and earn it out loud. Jasmine remembered a professor from law school telling her, once, no matter how brilliant you are, there are people who will always start you at zero. She didn't believe it back then. Not fully, but life had taught her otherwise. So when Karoline made that comment, casual, cutting, calculated, it wasn't just a dig at her resume, it was a statement meant for everyone watching who didn't fit the mold. Everyone who walked into rooms already having to prove they belonged. And Jasmine answered it, not by shouting, not by tearing anyone down. She answered it by telling the truth in a way that couldn't be picked apart by the end of that panel. Karoline's words had disappeared into the background. All anyone remembered was the way Jasmine sat, calm, spoke clearly, and reclaimed every inch of space she had earned that mattered. It mattered to the student watching alone in her dorm room, wondering if she had enough in her to keep going. It mattered to the school teacher flipping through lesson plans and thinking about all the times her work had been dismissed as less than it mattered to the kid, who had never seen someone who looked like them, shut down an insult without losing their cool. That moment wasn't viral because it was flashy. It was viral because it was true. And in a world where noise wins too, often clarity is a kind of courage. But moments pass, headlines fade, and the question always becomes, what now? It's easy to clap when someone says what you were too tired or too scared to say. It's harder to be the one at the table when the moment calls for it. Jasmine didn't walk into that panel expecting to be anyone's hero. She didn't need to be. She walked in prepared. That was enough, because preparation is power. So is presence. So is knowing who you are when someone tries to reduce you to a stereotype or dismiss your worth with a smile. The truth is, there are thousands of Jasmines out there. Women who graduated top of their class but were asked if they were really qualified. Men who got the job but were still told to prove themselves. Students who were told their schools weren't good enough. Their names too unfamiliar. Their credentials too average to be taken seriously. What Jasmine reminded people that night is, this where you come from doesn't determine what you know and where you went to school. Doesn't dictate what you're capable of. Respect doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who can stay rooted while being challenged. There was no viral trick, No media training behind her words, just lived experience, clear thinking, and a refusal to let someone else define her worth. That's not something you can rehearse, that's something you carry. And if there's a lesson in all this, if there's something to take with you, after the clip ends, after the applause fades, it's this. You don't have to shrink to be heard. You don't have to match someone's energy to prove a point. And you sure don't have to come from privilege to speak with authority. You just need to be grounded in your truth. Let the world say what it wants. Let them laugh. Let them question. Let them smirk. Because when your presence is built on preparation and your voice comes from real experience, no jab can knock you off balance. Jasmine didn't win because she fought. She won because she stood. And someone watching needed to see that if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you've experienced, share it. Send it to someone who might be questioning if they belong in the room they're in. And if you want more stories like this where real moments meet real meaning, subscribe to the channel. There's more to come.